Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about the Westroads Mall shooting.
Yeah, this one is it's a tough one for sure, and we've got a lot of source material to dig into.
We do. This one's pretty intense. I've been looking at this stuff all week, and I have to say, some of it's pretty hard to stomach.
Yeah, I mean, even though this happened back in 2007, it's one of those cases that really sticks with you, you know.
It does, and it's not just the event itself, but all the stuff that's come out since, all the music and the TV shows about it.
Yeah, you're right. It's like there's this morbid fascination with it.
Yeah.
This need to try to understand it.
Exactly, and I think that's what we're going to try to do today. So I guess the first question is, where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think we have to start with the basics, lay out the facts, the who, what, when, where, why.
Right. Okay. So December 5th, 2007, Omaha, Nebraska. That's where it all went down.
Yeah, inside the Von Maur department store.
A 19-year-old kid named Robert Hawkins walked in and opened fire.
Yeah, he was armed with a Westroads 10 rifle.
That's a semi-automatic, basically an AK-47.
Yeah, really powerful weapon.
Yeah. And he ended up killing 8 people and wounding 4 others before turning the gun on himself.
Yeah, it's just awful. And it's hard to even fathom what would drive someone to do something like that.
I know, and we actually have a copy of his suicide note, and it's pretty disturbing.
Is it?
Yeah, he wrote, I just want to take a few pieces of shit with me. Just think, though, I'm going to be fucking famous.
Wow. That's chilling. I mean, it's like he wanted to make a statement,
Yeah.
to go out in a blaze of infamy.
Yeah, and tragically, he succeeded in that regard. But before we get into Hawkins' background and, the why of it all, I think we should try to piece together what exactly happened that day.
Yeah, let's try to reconstruct the timeline.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we have the security footage from the mall,
Right.
and it shows Hawkins entering the mall around 1:36 p.m., but he's unarmed at this point.
So he's just casing the place.
It seems that way. He kind of walks around like he's getting the lay of the land, and then he leaves. He leaves the mall entirely.
And then what?
And 6 minutes later, he comes back in, this time with the Waze R10 concealed under his clothing.
6 minutes. Those 6 minutes must have been an eternity for him. Wonder what was going through his mind.
I know, right? Was he having second thoughts? Or was he just psyching himself up for what he was about to do?
We can only speculate, but the footage shows him taking the elevator up to the 3rd floor of the Von Maur store, the top floor.
And that's where it all begins. At 1:43 p.m., he starts shooting.
Chaos ensues.
Total pandemonium. We have some 911 calls from people inside the store, and they're just terrifying. People screaming, gunshots ringing out.
Can you imagine being there in that moment?
I can't. It's just too horrible to think about. Witnesses described him firing into the atrium at Shoppers on multiple floors, just randomly spraying bullets.
He fired 41 rounds in total, hitting 12 people.
6 of those people died instantly. 2 others died later from their injuries. And then there were the 4 survivors.
Yeah, some of those survivors suffered really severe injuries, both physically and emotionally.
Absolutely. Like Fred Wilson, he was an employee at Von Maur, and he was shot multiple times. He nearly bled to death on the way to the hospital.
And McKeel Oldham. She was shot in the abdomen and the back. Those are just 2 of the survivors, but all of them had to endure a really long and painful recovery.
And it's so important to remember that these 12 people weren't just statistics. They were real people with lives and families.
Right. They had dreams, hopes, fears, just like all of us.
And their lives were cut short because of this one young man's actions?
Yeah, it's a tragedy on so many levels. And I think it's important for us to take a moment to acknowledge each of the victims by name. Beverly Flynn, Janet Jorgensen, Gary Joy, John McDonald, Gary Scharf, Angie Schuster, Diane Trent, and Maggie Webb.
Their lives were stolen from them, and their families and loved ones were left to pick up the pieces.
Exactly, and it's their stories, their loss, that we need to keep in mind as we delve deeper into this case.
Right, because ultimately that's what this is all about, trying to understand what led to this tragedy and what we can do to prevent something like this from happening again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to do that, we need to understand Robert Hawkins. Who was he? What demons was he battling?
Yeah, because he didn't just snap one day. There was a long history of trouble, a pattern of disturbing behavior that goes all the way back to his childhood.
So where do we begin with that?
Well, we know that he was hospitalized as young as 4 years old for violent behavior in preschool.
4 years old, that's young. What was going on there?
Well, according to the records, he was acting out, aggressively hitting other kids, and even throwing furniture.
That's concerning. I mean, obviously kids can be rambunctious, but that seems like something more serious.
And it didn't stop there. When he was 14, he was sent to a treatment facility for threatening to kill his stepmother.
So these weren't just isolated incidents. There's a pattern of aggression and violence.
Exactly. And he was eventually diagnosed with ADD, PTSD, and mood disorder.
So he was clearly struggling with some serious mental health issues.
Yeah, and despite spending time in and out of mental health facilities, it seems like he never really got the help he needed.
And as he got older, things just seemed to spiral out of control.
Yeah, he was expelled from school for dealing drugs. He dropped out altogether. He couldn't hold down a job. His relationships were falling apart.
It's like he was on this downward trajectory and no one could pull him back.
Yeah, and about 2 weeks before the shooting, he broke up with his girlfriend after she caught him cheating. And there was also an incident where he threatened another teenager and her family over a stolen CD player.
Wow, so there were all these red flags, these warning signs that something was seriously wrong.
Right, and it all culminated in this horrific act of violence.
So now the question is, what can we learn from this? How can we prevent another Robert Hawkins from emerging?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think that's what we're going to try to explore as we continue this deep dive.
Yeah, we need to look at the systemic issues, the mental health system, the role of guns in society.
And we need to examine Hawkins's life in more detail to see if there were any missed opportunities to intervene, any chances to change the course of his life.
Right, because maybe somewhere along the way, someone could have reached him, could have helped him find a different path.
Exactly. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the aftermath of the shooting. How did the community respond to such a devastating event?
Yeah, let's take a look at the ripple effects of this tragedy and how it impacted not just Omaha, but the nation as a whole.
And we'll do that right after this quick break.
So you were talking about some of the documentaries that have come out about the Westroads Mall shooting.
Yeah, one that really stuck with me was Evil Lives Here.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one. They did an episode on Robert Hawkins, right?
Yeah, and it focuses a lot on his father and his ex-stepmother.
It's a really tough watch.
It is. They talk about how they were constantly walking on eggshells around him, never knowing what might set him off.
It's like they were living in a constant state of fear.
Yeah. And they tried everything to help him. They tried interventions, therapy, medication, but nothing seemed to work.
That must have been so frustrating for them to see their son struggling like that and not be able to do anything to stop it.
I know. And it makes you wonder if the system failed him in some way, you know? Were there missed opportunities to get him the help he needed?
That's a question a lot of people have asked in the wake of these kinds of tragedies.
Mm-hmm.
Is there more we can do to identify and treat mental illness before it escalates to violence?
Yeah, because it's clear that Hawkins was deeply troubled. I mean, the signs were there from a very young age.
And it's not just about individual responsibility either. There's a societal component to this as well. We need to create a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help for mental health issues.
Exactly, because right now there's still so much stigma attached to mental illness.
Right. People are afraid to talk about it, afraid to admit that they're struggling.
And that's a huge problem because the longer we wait to address these issues, the harder they become to treat.
Absolutely. And in some cases, like with Robert Hawkins, it can lead to devastating consequences.
You know, another thing that's often brought up in these discussions is gun control.
Yeah, that's a really hot button issue.
It is. And I know it's a difficult conversation to have, but I think it's an important one, especially in light of what happened at Westroads Mall.
Right, because the weapon that Hawkins used that was R10, it's a military-style assault rifle.
Exactly. And these kinds of weapons are designed to kill a lot of people very quickly.
And that raises the question of whether civilians really need access to these kinds of firearms.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to own a gun for self-defense or hunting, but these assault weapons, they're in a whole different category.
Right, and I think it's important to remember that the Second Amendment was written at a time when muskets were the standard firearm.
Yeah, things have changed a lot since then.
They have. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about what the Second Amendment means in the 21st century.
Absolutely. But, you know, even if we were to ban assault weapons, there's still the issue of all the guns that are already out there.
Yeah, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
There are an estimated 400 million guns in circulation in the United States.
It's mind-boggling, and it's one of the reasons why the U.S. has such a high rate of gun violence compared to other developed countries.
Right, and it's not just about mass shootings either. Gun violence affects communities across the country every single day.
You're right. So what can we do about it? I mean, it feels like such a huge and intractable problem.
It is a huge problem, but I don't think it's intractable. I think there are things we can do to make a difference.
What kinds of things?
Well, for one, we can start by addressing the root causes of gun violence. Poverty, lack of opportunity, mental health issues.
Yeah, those are all huge factors.
They are, and we can't just ignore them. We need to invest in our communities, provide support for people who are struggling.
And we need to have those tough conversations about gun control.
Right, because even if we can't agree on everything, I think we can all agree that we need to do something to reduce gun violence in this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, beyond the political and societal implications of this shooting, there's also the human cost.
Right, we can't forget about the victims and their families, the people whose lives were forever changed by this tragedy.
And the community of Omaha itself.
Exactly. The Westroads Mall shooting was a traumatic event for the entire city.
The Von Mars store where it happened was closed for weeks after the shooting.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like to go back there after something so horrific happened.
And a lot of people were afraid to go to the mall at all. They were worried that something like that could happen again.
It's understandable. I mean, it really shook people's sense of safety and security.
It did. And I think it also forced people to confront some uncomfortable truths about mental health.
How so?
Well, I think it made people realize that mental illness can affect anyone. It doesn't discriminate based on age, race, or socioeconomic status.
Right, and that it's something we need to talk about more openly and honestly.
Exactly. Because the more we understand about mental illness, the better equipped we'll be to help those who are struggling.
And to prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future.
So what broader lessons can we draw from the Westroads Mall shooting? I mean, how does this event connect to the larger issue of mass shootings in America?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to take mental health seriously.
In what way?
Well, we need to make sure that people have access to quality mental health care.
Right, because right now the mental health care system in this country is pretty broken.
It is. And it's often difficult and expensive for people to get the help they need.
And there's still so much stigma attached to mental illness.
Exactly. So we need to change the conversation around mental health. We need to make it okay for people to talk about their struggles and to seek help.
And we need to make sure that help is available when they need it.
Absolutely. But we also need to talk about the role of guns in our society.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that the U.S. has a gun problem.
We do.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have an honest conversation about how to address that problem.
Right, because the easy access to firearms in this country is a huge factor in our high rate of gun violence.
And it's not just about mass shootings either. It's about the everyday gun violence that plagues our communities.
So what do we do? I mean, it feels like such a daunting task.
It is daunting,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's hopeless. We need to start by acknowledging the problem.
Right, because for too long we've been in denial about the extent of gun violence in this country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we need to be willing to have those tough conversations about what we can do to make our communities safer.
And we need to be willing to make some changes.
Right, because the status quo is not working. We need to do better.
I agree. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it starts with each of us individually. We need to be more aware of our surroundings.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, we need to be more attuned to the people around us. Are they exhibiting any signs of distress? Are they making any threats?
Right, because often there are warning signs before someone commits an act of violence.
Exactly. And if we see something, we need to say something.
Yeah, we can't just turn a blind eye. We need to be willing to speak up.
And we need to be willing to get involved in our communities.
What do you mean?
I mean, we need to support organizations that are working to reduce gun violence and to promote mental health awareness.
Right, because these are not just individual problems, they're societal problems.
Exactly. And we need to work together to solve them.
And we need to remember the victims of gun violence.
Absolutely. Can't let their stories be forgotten.
And we need to honor their memory by working to create a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
That's a great point. We can't let fear and despair paralyze us. We need to channel our grief into action.
I agree. So let's keep talking, let's keep learning, and let's keep working towards a better future.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
It is, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Westroads Mall shooting.
It was a tough topic to cover, but I think it was an important one.
I agree. And we hope that this conversation has helped to shed some light on the complex issue of gun violence in America.
And that it's inspired you to get involved in your own communities.
Exactly. Because we can all make a difference.
We can, and we need to.
Until next time, take care.
You know, there's one more thing about this whole shooting that I think really drives home the human cost of this tragedy.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Two of the victims, Gary Joy and John McDonald, they were best friends.
Really?
Yeah, they were shopping together that day. Just walked into Von Mar a few minutes before the shooting started.
Wow. I didn't realize that. That's just heartbreaking to think that they were together in those final moments.
It is. It really highlights the randomness of it all. You know, it could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective.
It does. And it reminds us that these aren't just statistics. These are real people with real lives and real families.
And real connections, like those two friends who were just out shopping together.
Exactly.
Uh,
And I think their story really encapsulates what we've been talking about today. You
right.
know, the importance of understanding this kind of violence, the need to prevent it, and the importance of supporting those who are affected by it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a reminder that we can't afford to become numb to these events, to just let them become another headline.
Right. Because each one of these events represents a life lost, a family, shattered a community, traumatized.
So what can we do? I mean, we've talked about the big picture stuff, the systemic issues, the need for better mental health care, the debate over gun control. But what can we do as individuals to make a difference?
Well, I think it starts with being more aware of our surroundings, being more attuned to the people around us.
What do you mean?
I mean, paying attention to the signs of distress in others. You know, if someone is acting out of character, if they're making threats, if they seem withdrawn or isolated, those could be red flags.
Right. And we need to be willing to speak up if we see something that concerns us.
Exactly. We can't just assume that someone else will handle it or that it's not our problem.
And we need to be willing to reach out to those who are struggling, you
Yeah.
know? Just offer a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on. Let them know that they're not alone.
That's so important because sometimes just knowing that someone cares can make all the difference.
And we need to continue to have these conversations about mental health and gun violence. We can't just sweep these issues under the rug.
Right, because the more we talk about them, the more we normalize them, the better equipped we'll be to address them.
And we need to remember that change starts at the individual level.
Exactly. We can't wait for the government or some other entity to fix these problems for us. We all have a role to play.
So I guess the takeaway here is that we need to be more aware, more compassionate, and more engaged in creating a safer and more supportive world.
Well said. I think that sums it up perfectly.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Westroads Mall shooting. It's been a heavy topic, but an important one.
It has. And we hope that this conversation has given you some food for thought.
And maybe even inspired you to take action.
Remember, even small acts of kindness can make a big difference.
Until next time, stay safe and be kind to one another.